mother of all talk shows, the Open University of the airwaves. We're talking about Italy and Brexit, amongst many, many other things, with Stephen Woolfe, the member of the European Parliament, currently in Strasbourg right now.
Listen up, comrades of the world. Unite! The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway on Talk Radio.
We'll get you talking.
Now on Twitter, the Communicipalist says the EU is attempting to suppress democracy in Italy, undermine popular democracy in the UK, with help from cash-stuffed oligarch George Soros, and undermine Catalan self-determination. Brexit is a national liberation struggle. We simply cannot afford to lose. Well, with a small exception to one or two of those words, I agree. So I think does Stephen Woolfe, MEP, who joins us from Strasbourg. Stephen, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, George.
Let's start, if we may, with Italy, where, just like in Greece and in Portugal before it, the supreme arrogance of the German-dominated European Union was in full and ugly view yesterday, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was in the parliamentary chamber. I was about to do a speech on the increasing massive cost that the European Union is demanding from European countries to pay. 1.135 trillion is their budget, and they're going to be spending it on...
Has it even been audited, Stephen?
No, it hasn't, but they were about to spend huge amounts of money on creating a European army. And I raised the point to them, as said in my speech, you want to spend billions on a European army when you still have 25% of the euro area are in poverty and social exclusion. You have youth unemployment across the euro area at 20.9%, and in countries like Greece, it's 52%. And during the debate, you heard Oettinger, who is a German minister in the Commission, who is effectively in charge of spending this 1.135 trillion euros. And he said about Italy this. He said, George, unbelievable statement. He said, the markets, the financial markets, the markets will teach the Italian voters who to vote for and do the right thing.
Incredible arrogance. I mean, Teutonic, Prussian arrogance to a country which Germany formerly occupied and clearly thinks it still does.
But his arrogance is something that is just an intrinsic and core belief in those who support the European Union. I've heard people say, when we talk about Italy, that the Italians need to understand they are not allowed to leave the euro, they are not allowed to leave the European Union. It is essential that they stay, and it doesn't matter what their voters will say. And we've heard this before. We've heard it when the Irish were told to vote again over the treaties. The French were told to vote again in their treaties, and so was the Dutch were told. And we are now being forced in the United Kingdom to contemplate a second referendum because we've dared to leave. The European Union does not like the idea that the European electorate can choose politicians and parties who follow their mandates that they want. You have to follow the EU way or no way at all.
Of course, in the case of Ireland and France, the people in the end did as they were bidden. But that's not likely, it seems to me, to happen in Italy, because the anti-democratic outrage of the president acting on orders from Brussels, I have no doubt, of blackballing the finance minister nomination of a coalition that commanded the support of more than half of the Italian voters, is such that new elections become inevitable. And I doubt if the Italians will do what the markets and Oettinger are telling them to do.
Well, I hope not. And I was with last night and yesterday afternoon with a number of the Five Star Movement. I've worked with them on a number of projects. I'm working on them on other things. And we had long discussions about this. And what they told me was very clear, and in some ways an element of scary politics. They said, listen, Stephen, you've got to understand that the European Union worked with the Italian elites to remove Berlusconi. Even if we didn't like Berlusconi, they effectively removed him in 2011 to 13 to replace him with the European Commissioner, Mario Monti. They are refusing to allow our own finance minister this time round, Di Maio, and they're replacing him with Carlo Cottarelli,
of the IMF.
Director, his ex-IMF, who's known as the cutter or the scissor man, because he cuts public funding and hits the poor at the hardest he can. And what they then said is this, Stephen, they will try their best to prevent us having an election in August or September or October, and they will try and push it into next year to give them as long enough chance they can to ensure that they can change the constitution, work in a way to prevent us winning an election, as they've done in the past.
Well, we'll see how that all works out. I very much hope that the outcome is not as it was in Ireland and in France. And indeed, you may recall that Sinn Féin were prominently opposed to the treaty and big in the campaign against it, but have now become the most Europhile party in Europe for their own reasons, no doubt. We'll see what happens in Italy. What about Britain, Stephen? We have today, quite brazen, got to hand it to them. It's not just giving over the money and keeping in the background. George Soros is telling us what to do today and putting 6.5 million on top of the millions he's already given, where his mouth is. He is demanding that the British people vote again until they vote the right way.
Well, we've heard it before in Europe, in the European Union, to us before, and those other countries we've mentioned. George, it is an absolute disgrace. I remember clearly, and you've probably seen over the few weeks, how so many of the Remainers complained that there were billionaires out who are not British putting money into the Leave campaign to say that we could leave the European Union, and yet you don't hear one word of them opposing a billionaire who made his money on helping bring down our financial system in the market crash many years ago. He made billions on the day our pound and interest rates rose. He's made those money, and now he's demanding that we stay in a European Union because he feels it's right for Britain. He doesn't have a legitimate right to tell us as an electorate what we need to do, and he should butt out, quite frankly. But the Remainers will allow that to continue. They effectively worked with the President of the United States, Obama, to come over and say that we should stay in the European Union, otherwise we would be at the back.
Yeah, that was bad enough. It's bad enough to intervene in our electoral process. But this is worse, because we had our electoral process. We turned away from the advice of the foreign banks and American presidents that were trying to influence how we voted. And now they're trying to wreck a decision that's already been made by the British.
This is the disgrace of the heart of the anti-democrats, as I call them. And it's actually something that we've reached, I think, very clearly in our modern democratic history. We have a situation now where democracy is only democracy in the minds of those who believe that you voted for their own ideas. And that idea is you stay along the route of a corporatist European Union with globalist ideas where the corporates control everything, the markets, as Ottinger says. And what shocks me is how many young people in our country actually believe that the European Union is an ideal of equality rather than what Ottinger says, it's control of the markets and corporates over our lives. Lives where they can decide who's going to be in our government as they want in Italy.
Well, they keep telling us that young people in Britain love the EU, in which case they've never spoken to any of the young people in the EU. They haven't spoken to the half of all Greek young people that are unemployed. They haven't spoken to the half of all Spanish young people that are unemployed. They haven't spoken to the young people in Portugal and in many other places, not least of them in Italy.
And when they find young people that are opposed to the European Union, as they do in their millions in Poland and the millions in Hungary, they tell them that they're racist and xenophobic. And as we saw only yesterday again, George, they've turned around to Poland and Hungary and said, because you are voting a different way or doing things that we don't like, we're going to cut 33 billion euros from the money that you would have from the European Union. Take a picture of all of this, George, overall. In Italy, they're changing the governments and allowing their own people from the IMF to be put in charge. In Catalonia, they're effectively expelling the leaders who've been elected by the people in Carles Puigdemont to leave Spain and now being arrested on European arrest warrants in Germany, and saying that they can ban the Catalonian flag. In Poland and Hungary, they're removing 33 billion because of the people who have voted for leaders who audaciously stand up to the European Union. And in Britain, they're allowing quite happily to have people who are anti the democratic vote in the ideas of George Soros to fund campaigns to ignore the will of a referendum. Is that democracy or is that autocracy? And I think it's clearly the latter.
Now, Stephen, finally, and I'm grateful for your time, why don't you form a five-star movement in Britain? I mean, as I listen to you speak, I can't help thinking that the UKIP, before it imploded, made a mistake in not picking you as their leader. But there's a market for your kind of politics in Britain, and the five-star movement is perhaps a model that could be replicated here.
I'm very grateful for that, George. Thank you. And I do think you're right. There definitely is a space in British politics for that of a five-star movement. But you know how difficult it is to get on the ladder. You do know
I do.
You do know that you need to have financial backing and organisation. But it isn't something I haven't not looked at, George, and that I will admit here on your radio station that I've had conversations with people. It's not an idea that's disappearing from my mind. And I think now that over the past few months in particular, there are a number of people who once thought, okay, we can trust the government of the day to get on with Brexit and allow us to have that vote. And by all means, people can oppose it, but they must do it once the issue has happened and we've left Brexit. But there are people out there now saying there is time for something else. And I hope that over the next few months we can persuade those people to come together, and that we can finally have a party that actually crosses boundaries but says we can deal with the social issues, our economic issues in this country, but also allow democracy to flow.
Well, let me give you a hypothesis. If Labour betrays Brexit, as the Blairite ramp in the Parliamentary Labour Party is trying to force Jeremy Corbyn to do, if Labour becomes the instrument of destroying Brexit, there'll be potentially millions of Labour supporters so angry about that they'll be looking for somewhere else to go, and they won't certainly want to go to the Conservatives.
No. And there will also be an awful lot of people, and I've seen it, and I've seen the anger of people who have voted the Conservative Party, both in the north, in the areas I grew up in, and those who have been traditional Conservatives who say they won't vote for them too. At the moment, we're stuck with a UKIP that's imploded, and it seems to be a one-issue party in terms of just addressing
it's going
the issue.
more and more ultra-right, Stephen. I don't know if you're following
That's
it,
right.
but this baton is batty in the extreme.
And I think you can't deal with the convoluted and difficult issues of Islamic extremism by blaming everybody who happens to believe in that religion. And that's where they've gone down. And there are issues that do need to be dealt with. Everybody accepts that. But you can't just concentrate on that as the issue. And if you don't look at the broader political impact of economics in our country, what's happening to people across our nation, and look at it in a broader spectrum, then you're never going to be able to create policies that engage with everybody and actually try and say we can have a better future in our country by having policies that are inclusive and happen to deal with fair taxation, improving our NHS, opening the routes for education and training, to be able to control migration in a proper way, removing the language if we can, opening the doors to democracy, having freedom of speech, but more than anything, at the core of everything, the people matter first, and the elites must always come last.
Stephen Woolfe, Member of the European Parliament, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows.